Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Niger Ennis Presents The Trump Revolution, a part of the TvAbraham network. Well, folks, those of you who have been following me, and we seem to be, our broadcast, thank God, and the TvAbraham network in general has been exploding in terms of the viewerships. As you know, we have an audience that's primarily in the United States. But to my great pleasure, our second largest audience is in the Middle Eastern region, and Indonesia, believe it or not, is our largest audience outside of the United States. Now, normally we talk about foreign policy issues, but from time to time, a domestic issue comes up vis-a-vis the Trump revolution that is most notable and most important. And one of the most notable is Trump's historic relationship with HBCUs, which stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities, and his recent initiative and many would say uplift of HBCUs. We have the perfect guest to have on today. I was actually in Washington a few weeks ago, and I was turning the TV stations on, and I saw on PBS the show To the Contrary, where PBS brings giant intellectuals of the feminine point of view. And it was my pleasure to see April Chapman on, not only holding her own, but kicking butt for those of us within the traditionalist, constitution-loving conservative movement. April Chapman is a Project 21 ambassador. Project 21 is a network of Black conservatives, which is about 35 years old. And April, you can see with my gray hair, I'm actually one of the founding fathers of Project 21. And we're so pleased and proud to have you as one of our ambassadors. April is also founder of Standard House Media, a Christian media company based outside of Atlanta. And she also runs the Standard and Home Living Christian lifestyle brand. She enjoys laughing uncontrollably, as you can see with that terrific smile of hers, and reading about church history and spending time with her husband and four wonderful children. April, what a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Niger, for having me. It's so funny that I haven't even seen myself on the contrary yet. So I've got to follow up to see if I can get a replay of that appearance. That was
You got to
fun.
see it because you totally dominated the show, not with time, but just with the articulateness of your points of view. So,
Well, thank
April,
you.
let's dive into HBCUs. Of course, historically Black colleges and universities, one might say spiritually, was a child of the Civil War,
Mhm.
of the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, something that I term as the Black Bill of Rights, if you will. They were established for the newly freed slaves. And perhaps most importantly, the tragic child of the end of Reconstruction, which came to the point the rise of Jim Crow and segregated America. And basically, those who had the interests of Blacks in mind, including many Black scholars and intellectuals, established HBCUs because Blacks could not get admittance, in large part, to majority white universities and institutions.
Right. So it's funny, sometimes you have to give your entitles or your credentials to kind of help people understand your worldview. So as it stands, I'm just going to lay out quickly my resume. I'm Black. If you can't, haven't noticed, I'm married to a foundational Black American heterosexual male. I grew up in
Oh,
the
God bless
Bronx.
that.
Right. I was born and raised in the Bronx, so I've got some street cred to my name. But more importantly than that, I actually attended an HBCU. I went to Spelman College. So I'm quite familiar with HBCU life. And I thought that this topic was interesting because, as we'll talk later, I have a different point of view as it relates to HBCUs and the future of them as an institution. So I'm interested in discussing and comparing and contrasting how different administrations have engaged and handled the dilemma of HBCUs, whether it's with their lack of funding or, their matriculation rates and things of that nature. So let's get into this
Let's get
discussion.
into it. I also have a connection to HBCUs. I didn't attend one of the classic HBCUs. I attended Georgetown University, but just
Okay.
across the street from that is, as you know, is Howard University, which my younger brother attended, and my niece a few years ago graduated a historically black college and university. So, the let's start with exactly what you laid out, which is comparing, if you will, the Bush administration, I'm talking about Junior W,
Right.
his administration vis-a-vis HBCUs, the Obama administration, which seems to have a love-hate relationship with HBCUs, and then
Right.
I think pleasantly surprising, very positive, affirmative Trump relationship with HBCUs.
Right. So to kind of simplify this, I built a chart so that we could compare and contrast each administration's response, whether in the affirmative or the negative to HBCUs. And surprisingly, there were executive orders by each of these administrations, right? So you've got Bush 2, who was in office from 2001 to 2009. Then you got Obama. Then you have Trump 1.0 and then 2.0. And all of them, or should I say, Trump and Bush actively and proactively made positive strides in terms of funding HBCUs and lending support toward them. And it's interesting because there was an article that you sent me where President Obama, believe it or not, is in the minority, and there is an unfavorable view of President Obama's response to HBCUs in terms of funding, and he didn't carry that same level of dedication and direct funding as his predecessor, George
Well,
Bush,
and,
did.
and worse than that, and on that topic, April, didn't President Obama actually fail to renew a grant that had been set aside by George W. Bush
Right.
during his administration?
Right. There was an $85 million annual direct fund that he failed to renew. And then he also clawed back and changed the parameters for the Parent Plus loan. And so a lot of his critics were saying, well, this devastated the opportunities for a lot of Black Americans to attend school. And they were shocked that the first Black president of the United States would have this response. So for me, as a conservative, folks might expect me to automatically side with Bush and Trump on their position on HBCUs. And while I applaud the fact that what they did helped reshape the narrative of, white supremacy, and we don't, no one cares about Black people and they're always leaving us behind. But to be fair, and I don't know how your audience is going to handle the take that I have on this, but on this issue,
We put on our big boy pants today, so bring it on.
right, on this issue, I actually, believe it or not, I agree somewhat with President Obama. I actually
Wow.
do. I feel like for the first time, the HBCU community and Black Americans at large, we were expecting Obama to follow in the same footsteps and rub us on our back and give us more money. And he did something that we are not used to. And he actually had some legitimate criticism. Mind you, I went to an HBCU. So I
Right.
know what it's like to attend a school where there are facilities that are dilapidated,
Yeah.
right? Where the athletic program is subpar,
Right.
where you're in the 2000s and in the 90s, and dormitories still don't have air conditioning. And
Oh my
I
God.
attended an HBCU that was well endowed. Bill Cosby gave Spelman, at the time that I was there, a lot of money.
Yeah.
Okay. And my freshman dorm, shout out to H. Howard Harrell Hall, was one of many dormitories that had no central air conditioning or window units. Okay. We was just hot in Atlanta weather for no reason.
Wow. Hot and
And so,
humidity.
right. So there was this tough love approach. Obama did not coddle HBCUs. He actually challenged them by highlighting the low graduation rates. He highlighted the high default loan rates, and he demanded accountability, and he got accused of being tone deaf. And I think it had more to do with the fact that they're like, well, you didn't attend an HBCU, so you can't speak. But from my vantage point, in true conservative argumentation, this was the first real chance for HBCUs to empower students with financial literacy, right? To give them some more academic discipline, to say, well, why is it taking y'all 6 years to matriculate from this school? Why aren't you guys graduating on time? Do you really expect me to keep throwing money at a system that overwhelmingly is riddled with internal fraud? I mean,
Yeah.
Morris Brown was a college in the Atlanta University Center that faltered and was unable to keep their doors open because of financial mismanagement. And
Well,
so,
no,
go
I
ahead.
was
I'm
just gonna say,
sorry.
no, that's quite articulate, and I agree that HBCUs are kind of a tale of two cities. On the one
Right.
hand, you do have a low, proportionately speaking, graduation rate. On the other hand, over 70% of African Americans that get BAs in the country get them from HBCUs. So it's like those that, like yourself, who graduate do extraordinarily well in professional life after graduating HBCUs. On the other hand, there are far too many of our children that are either left behind or that fail to graduate from HBCUs. Well, let's jump away from Obama just for a second. We're going to come back to him,
Right.
but
Well, just to correct the record, I
sure.
actually dropped out of an
Oh,
HBCU. I did not finish at Spelman. And do you want to know why? It was financial. The cost of attendance, in light of the financial resources that were made available to finish, I ended up leaving halfway through because I couldn't afford to stay.
wow, that is very interesting. And that's probably an insight to a lot of the struggles that your fellow classmates and others that attended HBCUs had to go through. And it
Right.
needs to be addressed. But and we can go a little bit further than that, because I want to get
Right.
into how President Obama also communicated. And I couldn't find this because I was desperately looking for backup on this, but I recall that President Obama had philosophically an agenda not to kill HBCUs, but to minimize HBCUs because he had a philosophy that more and more blacks should integrate into predominantly white institutions. Do you recall that discussion?
I do, and if you think about it, if he's the very first Black American or pseudo Black these days, we don't know what Obama really was, but for the sake of the conversation, let's just say he's the first Black president. And we understand historically why HBCUs existed. I love Booker T. Washington. I think he's one of the most brilliant thought leaders
Absolutely. He's
of
my
all
personal hero.
time. He
Yep.
built a school brick by brick so that he could educate his own people so that they could compete in the
And
marketplace.
educate them in really fundamental tools that they would need to survive a
Right.
segregated South in America.
Exactly. So, because Obama is looking like, okay, it's been more than 100 years since then, Obama's position probably was, why do we still even need these institutions? We're always talking about wanting to have a seat at the table and be included, yet we are self-segregating ourselves. And then our outcomes at these institutions of self-segregation are not doing as well. And so I'm not an Obama apologist. I absolutely despise the man's presidency and his policies, but I believe there's something there to that discussion. And we need to talk about it. And I
No,
don't think we
I
talk
think
about
that's
it
fair.
enough.
I think that's absolutely fair. And certainly the great Booker T. Washington, as well as his adversary, W.E.B. Du Bois, would agree on one thing, which is that one thing for sure is that HBCUs should teach literacy, financial literacy,
Right.
accountability, and responsibility. So I think they would all agree on that and agree with you and the points that you're raising. Well, what is it, let's talk a little bit about even if you may disagree, what Trump has accomplished in his very new initiative vis-a-vis. It's something about permanence, right? Because every
Right.
year the HBCUs would have to come to the federal government with their tin can and say, hey,
Right.
give us some resources we need to operate. And Trump put in an executive order that gave a degree of permanence. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in 2017, he moved the HBCU initiative back to the White House. He reconstituted the Board of Advisors, promised modernization, private sector partnerships, and from a funding level, he permanently funded them. If you guys would remember, he just said, I'm meeting with all of these HBCU college presidents, and I'm asking, like, y'all back again? Why y'all still here? And they're like, sir, we have to do this every year. And he's like, well, why? Let's just permanently fund you so you don't have this revolving door of asking. And so he absolutely did that. And I don't believe he is celebrated enough for that. But here's the fundamental problem for me. President Trump has actively put his money where his mouth is to actively fund these schools. Billions have poured in through, the Pell Grants and all of that. And yet, they are still ungrateful. They will not give him credit for what he has done. It's almost like you have that child that's well past.
More than that, when the Secretary of Education spoke at a commencement, a large portion of the audience turned their backs on her in protest.
Exactly. They are disrespectful and they lack gratitude. And for me, Trump is way better than I am because I would have said, I'm not giving y'all a dime. You're ungrateful. I've done more than any other president. And this is the thanks that I get. You still use these institutions as centers of indoctrination. We allow you to take federal money and you still push your racism and your hate and your black supremacy, and yet you still out here with your hand out. You're still asking
Yeah.
for money. And so I think we can have a conversation that two things can be true at the same time. President Trump overwhelmingly put his money where his mouth is and funded HBCUs more than any other president. And then yet, I still believe that it was a form of creating more dependency because the way the
And then
funds are.
an entitlement mentality, I think you would
Right,
say.
because these campuses are still dilapidated. They're poorly managed. They're plagued with financial mismanagement. The athletic programs lag behind. Even the substantial subsidies, because of their priorities, they're misplaced. They're mad because he doesn't bow the knee to the god of DEI. And he's effectively saying, you guys can compete on the basis of your merit. But yet you want our money, but you don't want to hold to the same standard and you want to maintain your hypocritical position, which is a problem.
April,
It's a
let me
problem.
ask you this. I don't know when folk are watching this broadcast, but just recently, a few days ago, President Trump stood in a press conference with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu,
Mm.
and laid out an unprecedented peace plan for Gaza and that region, which has yet to be accepted by Hamas. Hopefully, by the time you guys see this broadcast, they will have accepted.
Right.
But for the moment, they have not accepted. But should they do, what will be created is some type of leadership board of directors that will be led by President Trump to make sure that the Israelis are doing what they promised, that the Palestinians, including Hamas, do what they promise, especially releasing the hostages that have been there for over 2 years,
Right.
which is an absolute disgrace. But let me
Mhm.
ask you this, April, and I really don't know what your answer is going to be. Do you think through the Department of Education and the cabinet person there is Betsy DeVos, I believe,
Yeah.
through the Department of Education, should Trump link his leadership and some demands on these historically black colleges and universities for the funding that they get? So essentially, the way he is now being chair of the redevelopment of Gaza, he should be the chair through his education secretary of the reforming and revising of HBCUs.
Absolutely, he should. if he is holding all of these other universities and institutions and holding them hostage by saying, if you want our money, you got to quit, indoctrinating
In
with this
DEI
Marxism,
nonsense,
with the
in the far
right.
left socialism nonsense, et cetera, et
Right. So
cetera.
if the white institutions are held to a strict standard where the accreditation has to be what it needs to be, and that they are not allowed to use the DEI and the critical race theory and all these diversity metrics, why is it that the HBCU gets a pass? If you're going to have some sort of commission or board that has to report and be held accountable at the white institution, I thought it was about us all being treated the same and being equal. Hold the HBCU to the same standard. Because here's another standard. The white institutions are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of ethnicity with all of these weird DEI standards. Why is it that the HBCU in 2025 still is allowed to racially segregate and not actively say, well, we welcome white students? I know it wouldn't be an HBCU anymore at that point, but if this is 2025, why do we still have legal barriers of Jim Crow-esque type
No, we should
policies?
not.
Why do those still exist?
And
And if
by the way, I didn't even know that that existed. In fact, I was pleasantly pleased to see a number of non-black, white, Middle Eastern, Asian attendees of
it's
HBCU.
very small. It's not a lot, but if you think about the climate on these campuses, I am telling you, if you are white and you were to attend one of these schools, it is incredibly uncomfortable. And you're probably there because you hate yourself, because you're going to get inundated with messaging of how horrible you are as a white person. And so,
Wow.
if they claim to be inclusive, why not aggressively recruit white or Hispanic students? Could it
And
be
and
because
and
they don't
and
want outsiders to see just how toxic and racially exclusionary and fiscally irresponsible some of the administration at these schools have become?
and to your point, revise and reform these programs. I mean, you can teach the rich history of African Americans in America and what we have had to overcome. You
Right,
can teach how we overcame these tragedies with some very critically important white allies,
right.
who are our American brothers and sisters. And we can talk about how we have come closer to Dr. King's dream of a colorblind society. These things are very easy to implement, and I would argue that certainly in the beginning of HBCUs, that is exactly the kind of thought process that was being implemented at his
Right.
Black colleges and universities. God forbid if we had DEI back in the 1890s and early 1900s when these institutions were being established, African Americans would not have become nearly as successful as many of us have. Uh,
That is true. That is true. I mean, some of our brightest minds, a century ago matriculated from HBCUs. If you remember athletically, all of the really good athletes in the 60s and 70s, they all went to HBCUs. But I think there is something going on with us as a people where we no longer believe that our institutions are good enough, because if that was true, we wouldn't be running to Notre Dame. We wouldn't be running to UGA. We wouldn't be running to all of these other schools fighting to play for them when it's like the talent, all of the brown people in the NFL and the NBA come from the black community, like we're black.
sure,
So it's like
sure.
something is psychologically going on where we have internalized and believed, okay, well, that institution must be better, as opposed to us saying, listen, let's make our own schools better. Let's work
Absolutely.
on our athletic department so that we can recruit star players. And you can start by making sure that everything is not broke in the locker room, and that the stadiums look nice. You take that money and you do something with it. And not only that, why aren't we funding our own institutions? We're always talking about how we built everything, we built the country, but yet we can't build up our own schools. And we're constantly running to DC and Washington begging for federal money. But then when you want their money, but you reject the accountability of how the dollars are spent. The reality is this, Niger: Bush and Trump should never have written blank checks to these institutions. We can celebrate that they did it, but the money could have been used in a different way to what I would say give it directly to the students in the form of a voucher. And then let's see how those students spend that money. Let's see where they would
I
choose
love
to
that
get their
idea about this.
education,
Sure.
right? And instead of propping up these institutions that too often were failing the very communities that they were supposed to serve, put the money in the hands of the people.
I think that is a brilliant idea. I'm very much for it. And I believe in the tough love that President Trump has given to Harvard should
Yes.
be expanded to the funding train to HBCUs as well. Well, that is going to be the last word. April, thank you so much. For those that want to learn more about the other organizations that you lead regarding the Christian family,
Yes.
where should they go to and how can they contact you directly?
So the best way to find me is on my podcast. It's Unshakable with April Chapman. I'm on YouTube, X, Rumble, Facebook, Instagram. I'm even on LinkedIn. So I have a podcast, Unshakable with April. You can go to unshakeablewithapril.com. The Standard House Media, my media company is what powers that podcast. So they can find me on all social platforms.
Wonderful. Well, April, it is a pleasure having you on again, or having you on. I hope to have you on again in the future
Absolutely.
as we watch very closely what the Trump administration is going to do with the great love that they've given to HBCUs. But now comes the, let's call it the Harvard treatment, where there's going
Right.
to be some accountability for the funds that they receive. Thank you so
Absolutely. Thank
much,
you so much for
April.
having me. Have a good day,
My
Nigel.
pleasure. God bless.